West Tunnel, who wishes he could be here. I don't know quite how he and I talked to each other. He went to London and I came here, but I think I got better into the deal to some degree. But I would tell you that the oil spill has changed us at HRI tremendously. And there's still great interest in the oil spill around the country. Wes and I in particular, we've been to San Francisco, Chicago, we go to Finland for about 3 weeks to talk about oil spill of all places. All along the east and west coast, there's tremendous national interest in this oil spill and the Gulf of Mexico. I think as some pundits have said, now everyone in the country knows about the loop current, and and I think that's wonderful and a great degree to advance all the work that this group is doing, it needs to do and can do. I think it's frankly, there are silver linings in all the dark clouds, and one of those I think is an opportunity to promote what's happening here and the importance of the Gulf of Mexico to all, but it certainly made that point. For me, I think, and both Dan and David, I appreciate the introduction, have made this point. I'll just very quickly make it. The things that came out to me when this oil spill started in the first month, where it was one area, talk about how closely linked the economy of the Gulf of Mexico and environmental health is. I know many of us around here talk about this a lot and try to make that point. Always difficult to illustrate. Well, now we have a perfect, unfortunately, perfect example of just how closely that's linked and the immediate and economic impacts of this situation. The other, again, which David made and that Dan made, is that it certainly pointed out that the Gulf of Mexico is an international body of water that was shared between 3 countries, and this oil spill has the potential to affect all of them. And I think that point was made really clear and why it's so important. One of the aspects of this organization to move forward on is looking at international responses to oil and gas development. But not only in our own countries, in our own coastal waters, but we have areas like the Eastern and Western Gap, which we share, that needs that international attention. I know everyone, and I say this in my talk some, is that everyone's entitled to their opinion about whether we should be doing offshore drilling for oil and gas or we should not be doing that. That's an opinion. But we're not entitled to our own facts. And the fact is, in the U.S., we've gone through 8 different presidents with this similar issue. That basically, no matter how quickly we can move to renewable energy sources, and we should, no matter how rapidly we move, we're going to be dependent on oil and gas resources for the foreseeable future through our lifetime, unless we're willing to make sacrifices that certainly in the U.S. we don't seem to be able to make. So what we have to do, and I think that's why this group can be so important, is how do we have a good economy? How do we deal with oil and gas issues in the Gulf of Mexico and protect the environment at the same time? That's something that I think this group can play a key role in and is perfectly positioned to do that. So let me just make a couple of comments. Our first speaker covered it elegantly. Let me kind of make a couple of points there. There was a decision made early on by primarily EPA, but NOAA and others as well, is that the greatest potential harm from this spill would be to Louisiana wetlands. And so there was a massive use of dispersants and other activities, the main goal of which is to keep the oil as far from shore as possible, at least the surface oil, and they moved in that direction. And that strategy may well prove to have been an appropriate one, certainly for the wetlands. I think as I've talked to my colleagues in Louisiana and other states that work in these wetlands, they're feeling much better now about the potential impact of those wetlands than they did during the spill. That in fact, the impacts may be marginal and not driven into the heart of those waters. We won't know for a couple of years, but they feel a lot better about that. But as was stated by several of our speakers, that came at a cost. And the cost was, I think, tremendous impacts on the oceanic system. And that's what we don't know what will likely happen there. We had Dr. Sherwood Earl, who's our chair, her and a number of scientists were out in the middle of the spill off of an area called Ewing Bank, which is just to the west of the spill. In one photographic frame that I have in my office, there were 90 whale sharks on the surface, probably 200 in the group that was there. As they were observing them, whale sharks, of course, were filter feeders. basically big biological skimmers. And there was oil in the area, and the whale sharks were skimming right through the oil like it was not even there. They didn't notice it. So the impact on those, we won't know for some time because they're not going to float. They sink. When they die, they disappear. So we don't know what the long-term, short-term, long-term effect. That's a big deal. Bluefin tuna, of all the species that could be affected, this is the one that might have taken a fatal hit, perhaps, to that population that comes into the Gulf, because, of course, it spawns only in that area where the oil spill occurred and only during the time when the spill was going on. They're already tremendously overfished internationally. They're not allowed to be fished in the Gulf, of course, but the long lines capture them at bycatch routinely. So that will be a species that we'll watch very closely. Others include, that have not been talked much about, tarpon. The tarpon, of course, don't spawn in these areas. They spawn in other areas in Mexico and Cuba. But the adults, as many other species, come to the Mississippi mouth with an abundance of food there to feed. And so they were in those areas in large numbers as well. Of course, they're on the surface. We already talked about the eddy currents and so forth. So we will not know those impacts for a number of years. Today, we have, the Harbor Research Institute has 2 vessels out on the spill. One of them is the Gyre. They are taking bathyc samples. We had 4 vessels lined up, but the Coast Guard canceled out 2 of them for reasons that I'm not real happy about, but that's a whole other issue. We still got 2 vessels out there. One of them is sampling the very deepest waters. This is taking bathyc samples of the bottoms, the very deepest waters up to about midpoint of the shelf. The other vessel is on the shelf and working the other way. The goal of that research is really to just answer the question of where the oil went, because there are conflicting reports of oil in some of these sediments and are not being found. So we hope this will give us some answer. Our original cruise plan called for around 800 samples in the 4 vessels. We'll get a couple of hundred samples out of this, and so that will help answer that question. So we'll see going forward how that might work. One of the other points that came, and I appreciate Alberto's comments on this, was the Ixtoc spill. Of course, Texas and Mexico, that was our Deepwater Horizon, because the Ixtoc affected Texas and Mexico, as Deepwater did not in this case. And he's already covered that to a great degree, but one of the things that, of course, if you knew anything about Ixtoc and you watched Deepwater, the parallels were just amazing as the whole process went through. How the oil companies tried to respond to stopping the spill, many of the biological impact, and I think those will still be reflected there. But the disconcerting or the disappointing point for me of the Ixtoc is that obviously we didn't learn anything over that 30-year period after, because we had no improvement in what we could do, how we could respond, either technically, or we weren't even better prepared to make biological decisions. The EPA itself admitted that their tremendous use of dispersants was one big science experiment. They just had to fly by the seat of their pants. We should, and there was tremendous amounts of dispersants used in Ixtoc, but we didn't learn those lessons. So hopefully we will learn those lessons here. Part of what will confound that will be the Natural Resource Damage Assessment process, what is sometimes called NRDA. This is a legal process to recover or restore damages from the spill. Very complex federal process. Will go on for 10 to 20 years. It will probably make scientific study more difficult to some degree because of the fact of the legal issues that are associated with either side. May not. When we talk to BP at this point, and I'm not really in this loop, I'm just going outside, when I should say, when the trustees, both federal and state, are talking with BP now, they're agreeing that what we should all do is collect baseline data together, and then we'll make perhaps different interpretations. But let's all agree on the base data. So it's a laudable goal. I hope that that happens. It started that way with Exxon Valdez, but it didn't end that way. So I hope that will be a difference that we see here. There's also the question of the $500 million in research funds that BP has promised to make available. 50 million of that has been put out on the table and is working around the Gulf. A number of you are working on projects there, as is my institute. I am, it was supposed to be behind the scenes type of thing, but it was on the front page of the New York Times about a week ago, so we can probably talk about it. It's not as secret as But BP is moving forward with putting those funds into play. There was some concern. I was one of the ones we noticed said, are they actually going to come forward and do that? Are they really going to put the money on the table? They seem to. They're going to be probably running that money. I think it's almost assured they will run this through what's called the Gulf Alliance, will be the vehicle by which they will disperse those funds in a process that's being discussed now. I'm one of the ones that helping trying to design that agreement. We were talking earlier on the side. One of my goals, my concerns is the way that they're trying to put this, originally put this together was in the terms of allocating the funds to various centers. I've been concerned that the centers would be too provincial, perhaps state by state, rather than over thematic areas and expertise. I don't think, I have better feelings about that now. But one of the things I'm pushing very hard to do is to set up, to look at these centers. I think the center idea is very important because many of the issues or questions that need to be asked are Gulf-wide in nature. We need to move out from the very narrow views of direct impacts and look at these oceanic type issues, for example. That's the only way that they can be looked at. So I'm pushing hard for centers to be thematically oriented rather than locationally oriented, like in particular universities and things like that. I have this organization in that mind, that there are some issues that we could make use of some of those funds to address this issue. There are some international aspects of this, these questions that we need to answer that could well qualify for the center's approach if it stays the course. So you all stay tuned. Because I think, again, just as you've been in the right place and the right time for this issue forward, I think this organization can be in a similar situation to help move forward into the future to deal with these as we go along. So thank you for the